Hey everybody, welcome to the Face-to-Face Ministries podcast, the #1 resource for learning what it means to have a healed heart, connect more deeply with Jesus, and experience true and lasting transformation in your life. I'm one of your hosts, Kathy Little.
And I'm your other host, Melinda Wilson. Please hit subscribe so you don't miss the fresh content we're continuing to release. And while you're at it, we greatly appreciate your help in getting the word out by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a quick review. You can also keep up with us by following our social media by searching face-to-faceministries.org on Facebook. That's no spaces, no numbers, and no caps. And on Instagram at face-to-face-min, and that's all one word.
We want to invite you to join us in our free face-to-face heart healing network and in our premium network. Be part of a growing community of people just like you who are wanting to dive deeper into what it means to access the full benefits package of the cross and learning how to help others do the same.
Our team also offers one-on-one ministry sessions that can be done virtually, and you can also learn how to help others connect with Jesus and find healing in their lives through training we offer in the ministry model we use. And for more information about all of the resources, trainings, and events that we offer, visit face-to-faceministries.org. And while you're there, please sign up for our newsletter.
All right, so let's dive into today's episode.
Well, we have missed you. Welcome back. It is 2022, and this is our first podcast since when? December?
I think it was December. Life's been a little off for us as far as transition and a lot of exciting moves and big things. It's one of those big stressor things. We've had a pretty heavy season.
Well, this is the first episode where we are standing in a completely different location, and we're not in the bathroom of a truck stop in somewhere in the middle of the desert in New Mexico.
This is true.
This is actually in our new location in South Carolina.
Many of you, I think, already know that we were relocating to South Carolina in a new home and establishing that as a ministry hub, a ministry base for us. And we're here. We're not quite settled yet. We're working on it. But man, what an amazing, beautiful location God has given us and a view. And we just had a massive snowstorm. For those of you paying attention to the news, and some of you are in its path as well. Izzy visited us, and in the South here, they don't quite know what to do with it. They don't have plows, so you're stuck in your neighborhood until it melts.
Yeah, someone told me that they have 2 plows for the whole state of South Carolina, which is like ridiculous, but
I'd believe it.
Yeah, I mean, because it's so rare, but I love, love, love snow. I hardly ever get to see it. Growing up in the Bay Area of California, there was no snow. I'll tell you right now.
That's true.
So we would have to drive 4 hours to it, and it was just a special, special thing. But to see it snow yesterday, of course, I stood out and walked in as much as I could until it got dark, and love it. It is beautiful.
It's nice, except when it prevents you from getting things done that you need to, which require you to drive out. But we want to thank all of you who are part of that transition, that move several of you gave to our relocation fund. Just want to thank you for that.
Yes.
And very, very thankful to have all of you podcast listeners. You're the ones that make it worth it for us to put the effort forth to know that we're adding value to your lives in some way. And we've got a lot of great stuff planned coming up over the next couple of months, including 4 in-person Emmanuel Approach trainings. And we're going to give you some more information about that in a few minutes. Also, we have a Dashaway weekend for ladies on the East Coast in Moravian Falls, North Carolina. We'll give you some more information about that as well. But for now, we want to introduce our guests. So Melinda, who do we have today?
Curt Thompson is a psychiatrist. We actually met him a few years ago at a conference, and I have been addicted to his podcast. He actually has his own podcast, which he will mention, but he is a neurobiologist, which we have had, of course, neurotheologian in Jim Wilder, but Curt talks deeply about relationships, and he's inspired by deep compassion for others, and he's, of course, informed from a Christian perspective, and so he brings Christ into everything. But he really shares practical applications for developing more authentic relationships and fully experiencing our deepest longing, and that is to be known. We had a wonderful time with him. We'll definitely have him back. And I know that you will love Dr. Curt Thompson.
I'm very honored to have you with us today, and
goodness,
very excited about what God wants to draw out of this conversation. So,
yeah, we are delighted to have Dr. Curt Thompson. He also is a psychiatrist, as is Dr. Carl Lehman, that many of you know of, who founded the Emmanuel Approach. And so it's very interesting having two psychiatrists that are also deeply involved in helping people connect with Jesus and one another in healing communities. So I was thinking about that last night. I'm like, wow. So Dr. Curt Thompson, you are up in the Northern Virginia area. Is that right?
I am in Arlington as we speak. Yeah.
In Arlington. So we're just going to dive right in because we don't have the 16 hours that I want with you. But I'm just on your website, and I love the description. Curt Thompson MD, inspired by deep compassion for others and informed from a Christian perspective, psychiatrist Curt Thompson shares fresh insights and practical applications for developing more authentic relationships and fully experiencing our deepest longing to be known.
Yeah.
And that is the name of your podcast, Being Known. And so I'd like to dive in and just first say, why is being known why is that important for you, Curt?
Yeah. Well, I think, we like to say that the brain operates kind of bottom to top and right to left, from just kind of directionally. And what that means is first we sense things as human beings developmentally, where we sense things and then we make sense of what we sense. And that's the way we are always operating in the world. When we're 3, when we're 23, when we're 83, we're sensing, and then we're always making sense. And then we sense what it feels like for us to make sense of things, and the cycle continues. And so, I think it was I'm in the process of doing this work as a psychiatrist, and at the time was probably about 15 years into my work after residency, and something about those first 3 verses of the 8th chapter of 1 Corinthians really captured my attention. This notion that Paul writes, he repeats this also in in Galatians. This notion that the person who loves God is known by God. Like, I don't know why does he say it like that? I mean, why doesn't he just say the person who loves God knows God? And you come to find that, goodness, this process of being known by God, like I'm able to love you more fully when I've had the experience of being seen by you, of being known by you, and especially the parts of me that I hate the most. And when you see the parts of me that I hate the most, when I am known by you, this is really, it's significantly different than what we moderns, we count knowledge. I want to know things. Now I say we moderns because Adam and Eve needed to do it too. I mean, this is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I want to know stuff. I want to take the fruit to know things, because the more I know, the more I can live life on my own, and I don't have to take the risk of being hurt by you. I don't have to live into my real vulnerable self. I can do all this by myself. And so I like knowing things, but there are certain things about me, as it turns out, that I can't know until I'm known by you. Certain things about my story, about the things of my unfinished business, my wounds, my traumas, certain things that without even knowing it, I've worked really hard to pack that stuff away because I can't tolerate it. And it's not until you start to ask me questions. When I want to know things, I'm the one who asks questions. I'm the scientist. I set the parameters for the research that we're going to do, whether it's with my chemistry lab or with my wife or my kids. I'm going to decide what the questions are. But when you ask the questions, you are pursuing me just like God pursued Adam, just like Jesus pursues John the Baptist's disciples and says, "What do you want?" in John chapter 1. And for us to be fully known, especially in the places where I carry most of my shame and my trauma, means that gives me the opportunity to be transformed. And how could I not love you when you are staying in the room, when all my stuff is exposed and you don't leave, and you welcome that, and you are compassionate and merciful. How, like, I don't have any greater joy than to do that, which then sets me on this path to enable me to, with energy and delight, create in the way that I was made to create. That's long-winded. It's
so good.
Well, it's not. Of course, we just kind of dove right in, and everyone wants to be known, right? We have have innate, built-in need, not just desire to be known. And I'm just wondering why it's hard for us, or challenging for many, to be known. Like we say we want it, but then, listening to your podcast last night about the story about the gentleman who was sharing about his affair and how there was just silence in the room after, and probably he was very afraid of what the response was going to be. And then there's just love, and this brings the healing and transformation you're talking about. But I think backing up, a lot of people may be thinking, well, I don't have anyone that's safe enough, or how do I know that it's safe to be known? And how do I even create that kind of community? Right.
Well, I mean, I think it is one of the most common phrases, one of the most common questions is, how do I find the community? And I think that part of the, part of the challenge in answering it is to say, well, I think your question is completely reasonable. And at the same time, if we look at what God does, God could ask the same question. I mean, I think this is what Jesus is doing in the Gospels, where he's, talking to his Father and the Spirit and said, like, how am I going to find these guys? And who knows? And as Paul Borgman rightly, says in his book on Genesis, when he says, who knows how many people God tried to get to go with him to Palestine before Abraham finally agreed. Who knows how many people turned him down? God didn't come looking and ask, like, well, where are the people that I can find who will just do this? Like, no, God had to, like, make it happen. And this is hard. This is hard. And I think that Jesus knows that this is hard to do. Jesus, like, we know that people left Jesus. We know that there were people who turned him down. I got to go check out the plot of land. The rich young ruler. No, I can't do that. And so we say, look, is there one person in your life, just one person, that you might trust to tell your story to? Is there one person by whom you're willing to take the risk? And if the answer is no, then we say, okay, then you may have to. Now, this is going to sound crass. We say, like, you may have to pay money to do this, to get it started. And the reality is, like, it could be a therapist, it could be a pastor. You say, well, I don't have to pay my pastor. Well, somebody pays the pastor to do this, but it may require more cost for you to enter into the practice of building enough resilience to be known, such that you can then begin to ask people and look for. And here's the other thing. The degree to which I am known and therefore healed also changes my capacity to perceive in the world who those people are that might be more likely to be part of that community. When I'm really wounded, my capacity to identify the people who would most likely be safe partners for this is fairly reduced. They're not obvious and it's not just because they're not obvious. It has a lot to do with the degree to which how my trauma makes it very difficult for me to even be aware of those people who might be safe. Yeah. And so we start someplace, and it might mean starting with a counselor. And that's where we begin.
Wow. Now, I was just thinking about that whole dynamic of shame too, because some people with their story, with the trauma, with decisions or choices, things happen to them, things they did or whatever, becomes a story that they bury out of shame. Because I know you also talk a lot about shame, your book, The Soul of Shame, really amazing, just from a beautiful, I actually have had some significant healing in that arena, wrote my own book and just kind of my own story out of that. But I would imagine that shame plays a big role in the ability to even want to be known. I mean, we need it. We want it. We know that we want it. But if there's that piece of our lives, that story that is like so ugly to us, we think nobody could ever love us if they knew it. And yet flipping the light on and having a safe place to share that diffuses all of that. So you can have your whole life bound by that shame, and finding somebody that loves you anyway in the midst of that, regardless of that, is really a beautiful, profound leap toward healing, I would imagine, from my own experience. What would you say to that?
Right. Yeah. Well, and here's, I would affirm everything that you just said, Kathy. And I would, add, I think about shame as this problem that I have, which we do. That's true. And I often think about it in terms of like, oh, this is a problem that I need to fix. And shame is the thing. Shame actually is less the thing than it being a signal. It is a representation that my capacity to relate intimately, interpersonally, is off kilter. Like the problem is not so much that shame is in the room. I mean, it is. It's kind of like I have a fever, and the fever is a problem, and the fever itself could kill me, but the fever is pointing to something else.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And what this points to is that trauma has happened in some way, shape, or form, even microscopically, in the context of intimate relationship, in the context of some relational interaction in which I have been vulnerable. I have been in the process of wanting to create or just be who I am in the room, and something began to happen, whether it's in my family or in my job or at school or on the football field or wherever it is, in which interpersonally shame was wielded and fractured that interpersonal dynamic. And, I would like it if I could just somehow, could you give me a pill? And I'd wake up in the morning and I just wouldn't feel this anymore. And, God acts less like a surgeon than I wish he would be, right? Puts me general anesthesia, do the thing, wake me up. And then, I got a couple of days of recovery and then I'm fine. But he acts more like a physical therapist, and we're going to rehab all this. And he wants me to be fully conscious, fully present, and fully participating in this rehabilitation act. And I'm like, I don't think this is a very good idea. And he's saying the healing of shame takes place in the very context where its origin took place.
Oh, interesting.
It took place in the context of interpersonal relationships at an intimate level, and that's where its healing is going to happen. Wow. Because God is not just about healing my shame. He is about healing the entire interpersonal, interactive dynamic that he has created in the world. Like he's coming for everything.
Come on. Wow.
And, I at first glance, I'm like, God, that's a great idea. God, yay, God. Like you're coming for everything until like you discover like, dang, like he's really serious about this.
And it involves us too.
Yeah. Right. And there are many, you think about the number of people that you just think like, gosh, I hope that heaven is a really big place so that I can just like find a very different place from because they might show up there, but I don't really think they should be there. Wow. And then when they're there, I'm like, it's just a big place. I'm just going to avoid them. or maybe like I'm going to be talking to Jesus. Like, I'm not sure how George made it in. Can you explain this to me? Because this is a problem. And Jesus said, well, I'm glad that you asked because on my calendar, I have a meeting with you and George together tomorrow at 2:00. Like the five of us, you, George, and the three Trinitarian partners are all going to have lunch together. And I'm like,
no. Wow. Yeah. Well, I guess that's just a summary of you're wounded in community, you're healed in community.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, so I was thinking, like you mentioned earlier, like, well, how do people find these groups? I'm thinking, like, well, wait a minute. If people are listening to this podcast, then people know about you. And if people know about you, people know something about your connections out in the larger community. And I would say, whoever are those people that that you represent and that and that are extensions of the work that you're doing, they would be people that people could call and say, like, I would like to find somebody who I can begin to practice telling my story with. I'd like to do this work of dismantling shame. I'd like to. I want to be the outpost of beauty and goodness in the world that God has in mind for me.
Hey, sorry for the interruption, but just wanted to make sure that you all know about our upcoming in-person Emmanuel approach trainings. We have several of them coming up. The first one is coming very quickly in Hampton Roads, Virginia, February 3rd to the 5th. And then we're heading out to Montana in the middle of winter. Yay, lots of snow. February 11th and 12th. And then we're going to be in the great state of Texas in Austin, March 4th and 5th. And here in our new hometown, the Greenville area of South Carolina, upstate, March 25th and 26th. Information on all of those can be found on our website at face2faceministries.org/training-events. Greenville registration's not quite open yet, but that will be very soon. But those other events, you can register straight away.
And if none of these places are anywhere near you, like let's say you're in Maine or in Florida or in, I don't know,
Nebraska.
Washington State. Yeah. And you're like, I really want to come to a training, but that's really far. You can bring us to you, to your area. So request a training, reach out to me, reach out to us, and we can answer any questions that you may have. And ladies, we are bringing Dash Away to the Southeast. We've had it in Lake Tahoe, California for the last few years, which we are still going to have July 15th to the 17th, save the date, but also Moravian Falls, North Carolina, Dash Away, April 1st to the 3rd. It is a beautiful part of North Carolina. So if you're in anywhere in the surrounding region, ladies, come to Dash Away, April 1st to the 3rd in Moravian Falls, North Carolina.
And we're going to have that registration open very soon as well at dashawayweekends.com, but please save the date for now. All right, back to our regularly scheduled interview.
Well, I was just going to say, moving beyond, because we have spent so much time talking about healing because that is our main focus, but I'd like to move even beyond that. Not that we ever get to a place of complete wholeness on this side of heaven, but of, okay, God's done all this work and I'm looking to go even deeper in community, deeper being known. I'm not embarrassed anymore of my stuff, whatever that is. And I kind of want to just talk about what you are passionate about, your new book, The Soul of Desire, because and I just noticed last night, I'm like, oh, duh. Each of your books has the word soul in it, and The Anatomy of the Soul, Soul of Shame, and The Soul of Desire. And so tell us about, and maybe you can include this in the question, why the soul? And then that's a huge question, but I also want to talk about beauty, because you talk about beauty a lot in the podcast and get what gazing upon beauty does for the person, but maybe just back up a little bit and talk about soul. What is that anyway?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, the first thing I can say is that the first two books, their titles were emerged in conversation. The one literally rolled off of the tongue of one of my patients. He was a writer, and the book was pretty much done. I just couldn't come up with a title, and the publisher tossed me 2 or 3 options. I didn't like them. This is not my forte, to come up with something that is, palatable to the ear. And he just said, well, why don't you just call it The Anatomy of the Soul? And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is just, because it really fits. We're talking about neuroscience, and but we're also really talking about soul. And what do we mean by that? And we have a long conversation about this. But what we're really paying attention to is this notion of the essence of who we sense ourselves to be, right? The core part of me. And there are different ways of talking about this. And at the end of the day, it's all quite mysterious. But one thing that for me is true is that when we talk about, interpersonal neurobiology, we talk about, brain science and relationality, like relationships and brain science and how they interact with one another. They're all converging to create within me a felt core part that we would say meets certain criteria that neuroscience would describe as a coherent system, as an integrated system. But what we would say is demonstrated from the biblical perspective is this is what it means for me to be ye whole, be ye perfect, even as my Father in heaven is also perfect. For me to bear the fruit of the Spirit. When these different dimensions and domains of my mind that are made up in part by my anatomy, my soul, the core part of me, is more grounded and is expressive of what it means to be a person of righteousness, a person of right relationships in the world, that necessarily then goes on, from the biblical perspective, we would say, goes on to create the environment in which our capacity to create, to make stuff, and to therefore reflect what it means to bear the image of God is given free rein in the world. And then I think, with this, just continuing this notion of shame, like evil targets our soul. Evil's intention is to devour us. And so at that intersection of all these different things, my embodied relational states and all the, 9 domains of integration of my memory and my attention and all those things that we talk about with, the neuroscience side of things, evil's intention is to just devour all that. And it makes no apology for it. Now, it's very subtle, it's very smart, but it makes no apology for this reality. And so shame in and of itself then becomes evil's tool that it wields to devour this essence of who we are made to be most beautifully. And I think then with this last book, then this notion of desire is that, we come into the world as just a bundle of appetites. Just a wrapped bundle of desire. And it never stops. But we live as if somehow, we should kind of cure that problem. We should somehow prune that problem. We shouldn't, and of course, I don't want in the middle of Safeway when I'm 25 years old to have a tantrum like I might when I'm 3. Of course, I don't want to do that. In the same way, at least, right? I just want to fall on the ground as an adult, and I don't want to do that. But we bludgeon our desires out of us, or our desires are truncated, our desires are contained, our desires get tangled up with the shame of our traumas. And then we learn that they don't belong. Or my desire becomes something that I can't live without. And so it becomes a raging addiction that devours everything in its path. And so either way, desire kind of gets a bad rap. And then we don't have the opportunity to recognize that at the end of the day, desire isn't just about my addictive appetites. My deepest desire really is to be seen by you, soothed, made to feel safe and secure, in order for us as differentiated, vulnerable co-creators, create beauty and goodness in the world that itself circles back around and deepens our connection with each other. And even in the face of ruptures, beauty is understood to be that which we create in the repair work of those ruptures themselves.
Wow.
And so there's nothing about the creative act of God in which beauty and its emergence is not seen as the ultimate outcome. Even on Good Friday, only part of the story is finished with those words.
Yeah.
Because God sees Easter coming, something that evil doesn't see coming. And so even in that moment of utter grotesqueness, God is always looking still beyond the edge of the horizon and seeing beauty coming over the edge. Even in the face of our worst nightmares. And this is what we do. This is what you do in your healing communities. You are imagining Easter coming with everybody's Good Fridays. And you're having to imagine it for people until their imaginations can catch up. And this is what God is doing by imagining beauty, not just in the places that are obvious with, great art and nature and so forth, but especially in the places where we would least imagine it happening.
You talk about listening to the podcast last night about beauty and gazing upon beauty, and even how the people gazed upon Jesus on the cross. And you mentioned a particular painting. I can't remember which one, but it's, I think, Mary holding Jesus.
The Pietà. Yeah.
Yes. And that you said that's something that people don't just glance at, they gaze at. And I would love for you to unpack that, because that, and even looking in each other's eyes, and you were talking about that, and that is scary to some people. Even the notion of stopping to enjoy something in our fast-paced culture, the word gaze, we don't do that anymore. And I'm wondering if you could unpack the importance of, and I had written something down. You said something like this, and please forgive me if I kind of chopped it up. Beauty is created by others gazing upon our trauma and chaos. And maybe I'm asking way too many questions in one statement, but I would love to hear you just unpack that a little bit more about gazing and stopping and actually paying attention to someone and their pain, or maybe they're not even in pain, actually just paying attention to someone. Why is that hard for us?
Well, I would say a couple things. One is that it begins in the beginning. This notion that when we read in Genesis 1, and God saw that it was good, I say a little bit about this in the book, that the whole notion of him, those texts saw that it was good, the Hebrew word for good can be transliterated into beauty. God saw that it was beautiful. And so then when we get to New Testament texts, we don't just then have, we're not limited to thinking about the good shepherd. We think about the beautiful shepherd, for example. Moreover, when we read and God saw that it was good, we don't just think of it in terms of like, well, there's this thing over there that God has made and commissioned, and he's looking at it now as the object of his creation, and he sees that it's beautiful and good. It is a sense in which the goodness, the beauty of it emerges as a function of God looking at it. It is a thing that happens in the process of being seen. Now, developmentally, this happens from the moment a newborn comes into the world. Because the newborn doesn't know this cognitively, but the newborn's brain is looking for mom's gaze. And the mother holds the gaze. And of course, the newborns, their gaze is like, they don't have a conjugate. They can't, right? They can't get their eyes to like focus and so forth. And it takes a couple of days. It takes a handful of days for that to happen. But that it happens has everything to do with them becoming aware of the mother's awareness of them. I mean, you know how it is. If you've held newborns, like you know, as long as they're not, pooping on you or they're not screaming at you, like you just want to hold them and look at them.
Right. Yeah, it's true.
And you want to gaze upon them, and and moreover, like you want to gaze upon them, especially in those moments where you capture their gaze looking back at you. And like, like as the parent, like I remember looking at my daughter, looking at my son and thinking like it's like watching the beauty of a sunset. Like you don't want this moment to stop. And this is what this is God and saw that it was good, and the goodness emerges. And so we draw forth beauty even as we look upon the child. Their felt sense of beauty is not just this objective fact. It is a process that is happening because of the interaction that I'm having in this moment. But at some point along the way, back to how trauma happens in interpersonal relationships, at some point, my distress and anxiety and traumas take place in the context of gazes. Shame, right, is delivered with a certain kind of gaze, right? It's delivered with a certain tone of voice.
Yeah, come on.
And so the whole notion then of being gazed upon now starts to get tangled up with shame. So the very act of you gazing at me means like you are coming closer and closer and closer to parts of me that I feel that I don't even know what they're about, but like it's too close. You're like I'm being undressed because you're simply gazing, right? You may have heard me mention in other places. We have this one little exercise with married couples, right? You sit them knee to knee, and for 5 minutes, only for 5 minutes, we say we just want you to take a couple of deep breaths, and then I want you to begin to look at each other with loving kindness. And I'll tell you, like the first 90 seconds are hell, because especially if they're not happy with each other, And they, it's like, or, we say, we don't want you to stare at each other. You can blink, you can turn away and come back, but we want you to gaze. We want you to hold each other's faces in your gaze. You get past the first 90 seconds where everything's very uncomfortable. And then you get about into about the next minute, and they start to settle in. And by the time you wrap things up, they don't want to stop.
Wow.
Because when is the last time that someone just simply looked at you with loving kindness, uninterrupted, for 2 to 3 straight minutes? Well, it's probably when you were newborn.
Wow. That's profound.
And if we allow this to happen, we then can practice taking that person's gaze with me. Right? We like to say it takes shame less than 3 seconds to register and be embedded in our neural networks.
Wow.
It takes a felt sense of being seen, soothed, safe, secure, upwards anywhere from about 60 seconds to about 3 minutes. It takes a lot more effort, work, time, focus, concentration, a lot more practice. But once it is developed, it becomes a thing to which we can return over and over and over again, which is why gaze is so important.
Which even dovetails into like the Emmanuel approach tools of connecting face to face with Jesus interactively and paying attention to how he responds to you and being able to receive his loving kindness and his gaze. That is very, very powerful and also a great argument for even attuning and just connecting, hearing somebody, seeing somebody, being present with somebody on so many levels. That is just, it's healing in ways that we are probably oblivious to. Most of us don't understand how powerful those things are and how much of a difference they can make. That's amazing.
Which is why, yeah, absolutely. Which is why in the confessional communities that we help to shepherd, there are any number of moments in which one person will say something that another person will find to be transformational. They said something particularly kind to them, or empathic, or they say, I just feel really protective of you. Something that they take in that moment, and the moment passes literally in 1,000, 2, 1,000, less than 3 seconds. The moment passes, and they might say, oh my gosh, like, thank you so much for that. And we will stop the process. And we will ask the listener, the one who's just heard the words of the speaker spoken to them. I'll say, Karen, I just want you to look at George. And I want you to allow him to look at you with his facial expression that he just gave to you. I just want you to allow him to hold your gaze with the words that he's just spoken. And of course, everybody's like, this is, and initially it's like, this is weird.
Wow.
And then we will say to Karen, we want you to, after you've done this, and after you've kind of calmed down and taken it in, we want you now to, between now and next week, we want you every day for at least 5 minutes. We want you to practice remembering, writing about, journaling about, thinking about the gaze.
Wow.
Even more so than the words, you can allow the words to take in. But remember, 60 to 90% of all that we do to communicate is nonverbal and communication. And my right hemisphere is really what holds my ultimate sense of the reality of myself and of the world.
Yeah.
And so if I'm able to hold your gaze, I can take you with me anywhere that I want. And I'll just keep returning to that. I don't have to think about the paragraph of things that you spoke to me. Now, I can do that, and that's not unhelpful, but it takes longer. And there's less association with the affective state than there is with the gaze and the tears, my tongue.
Curt, thank you for saying tears, because I just wanted to quickly talk about, because, hearing you in the podcast, you're often moved to tears, and it's actually incredibly beautiful. And I am moved to tears. I haven't always been moved to tears easily. And I think it's just through the healing and softening of my heart that I have been. But I guess 2 questions. Have you always been that tenderness of your heart, which is so beautiful, especially in a man? I mean, let's just be real, we don't see it very often. And secondly, something that you said last night, you didn't say it last night. I listened to it last night in the podcast. Our tears are an expression of our heart. Yeah. And because you were specifically talking about tears and then you just mentioned it. And so I'm wondering, first of all, just personally, Curt, have you always had this tenderness and been able to be moved to tears? Because I think it's a gift. And then secondly, what's the importance? Because a lot of people are afraid of tears, men and women. I used to think it was a sign of weakness. I'm the opposite now. I'm like, and some people are bottled up. And you're talking about Jesus catching our tears in a bottle. So just two things. Have you always been moved to tears by beautiful things or by other people's stories? And then why is it important that we learn to be able to be in touch with that emotion? Yeah.
I believe, I do think that temperamentally, I probably fall in a certain range that, and temperament is a fairly genetically kind of expressed thing. And so we hear a certain piece of music and I become tearful and somebody else doesn't. And real quick, two stories. One is I was in third grade and we were learning how to read longer stories. And our teacher was having us read these stories out loud. And so the night before I'm practicing reading the story, and my mother, who was an elementary school teacher, was helping me and she was just listening and so forth. So when we get to the end of the story, and I don't remember all the details, but the story was some story that involved a young girl and involved a raccoon. And the raccoon at the end of the story is leaving. She's befriended this raccoon, helped the raccoon, the raccoon finds his family, and the raccoon is leaving the young girl to go off and be a raccoon, as all raccoons should. And I'm reading the story to my mom, and I'm just a mess reading the story. And I'm aware that I'm not quite sure why, but I'm aware that all I know, I feel the loss. I feel the loss. Now, if you knew other things about my life, you might say, well, there might be some things that are connected to that. Okay, fair enough. So the next day, we're in class. And everybody, you read the story, we're coming, and I'm watching it, and I'm like, holy cow, I'm going to finish the story. And sure enough, it gets to the last two paragraphs that are left in this story, and you have to stand up. I stand up, and I can't stop it from happening, and I'm a mess. And I remember sitting down, and I remember my teacher from up front, looks at me with these very kind words, and nobody made me feel bad, but I was aware, one of these things is not like the others. In this room, as people are reading, my friends are kind of looking at me like, oh, that's interesting. Nobody was mean or shaming or anything. So that's one thing. Temperament. Here's another thing. So when our kids were young, growing up, we would read stories together as a family. The four of us would sit on the couch, and I was typically the reader. And there's a story called there's a book called The Indian in the Cupboard, which you may or may not be familiar with. But it's a story that at the end there is one of these moments where the Indian leaves. It's like this story lost. I cannot get through the story without doing this. My daughter, who is 7, 8, turns and says, "Oh, Daddy, you're crying." My son, who is 4 or 5, looks at me and says, "Cry, baby."
4 or 5. Oh, man.
Okay, now, yeah. All that to say, I know this is long-winded, maybe more than we want to talk about. I just say this: we have different temperaments. This has been mine. I'm aware that to at one level, all I can say is that there's very little that we talk about what it means to be human that I don't, as it turns out, end up feeling very sharply. I don't know if that's just me. I don't know if that, I don't know what all that is. I just know that that's the case. And so that's mine to live with. And that can be a gift. And it can also at times be something that I wish were different at times. But I can say this about tears, and that is that every tear means something. Every tear carries weight. Every tear comes from the center of the earth. It's not coming from the surface. It's coming from the center of the earth. And we dare not ignore them. And for our listeners who find that it feels embarrassing, or that our tears, we've been shamed about our tears, or we don't have access to our tears. We wonder about, guys, there's something wrong with me because I don't cry, and so forth. The other important news is that evil would love for us to find some way to connect shame with our tears.
Yeah.
I either cry too much or I don't cry enough, like something. But it is a sign. Our tears are an indicator of our grief. Not always. Sometimes we cry when we laugh. Sometimes we cry when we're happy, when we're thrilled. But they're also a signal of intimacy.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Because tears, we're aware that anytime somebody witnesses our tears, they are witnessing something from deep within us that is now being put on the outside of our face. And there's no part of us that isn't aware that the act of crying puts us in a vulnerable place. And then people around us have a choice. And the choice is they can come closer to us, or those tears can create discomfort in them that causes them to want to leave.
Or tell you to stop
in some way,
crying.
shape, or form. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a way for them to leave, right? Yeah. They want to leave. They want to leave by telling you to stop crying. I need to distance myself from your tears.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Curt, you said you had a hard stop. I think we could probably keep asking you questions. I do want to make sure that we know, could you just share real quickly with our audience how people can connect with your work, what you're doing, the podcast and your website and stuff like that, just so we can find you?
Yeah. A couple of things. There's the podcast, the Being Known podcast, that I host along with Pepper Sweeney. That's one thing. The other is you can follow me on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. And you can find my website, CurtThompsonMD.com, where there's some resources for folks. And then the last two things I would say about these confessional communities in which we're trying to really invite people to explore what it means to be part of these. We have a small nonprofit called the Center for Being Known, and you can find that thecbk.org. And thecbk.org also is working to create some opportunities for people to develop some of these confessional communities wherever you happen to be. And how can we, do that in at least getting things started. And then the other thing I would say is that in our practice, and we've just changed our name. So our new name is New Story Behavioral Health, newstorybehavioralhealth.com. Here in Falls Church, Virginia, we are actually actively conducting trainings for people. We just did our first one last week, training cohorts of folks who really want to learn how do we experience these confessional communities. And then that would be a first phase. And a second phase then is how do we then take this practice and take it out into the world, whatever domain that we have. Doesn't have to be a therapist. I mean, how do I take this into my church? How do I take this into my Bible study? How do I take this into my law practice? How do I, any of these, how do we do this in different?
Are those trainings only in person, or do you also do them by Zoom?
The one with CBK, that our little nonprofit, because we're going to try to make it available to as many people as possible on an online venue, that we're going to do that. But the trainings that we're doing at the practice, we're doing in person, because there's just a ton that you can really only do if you're doing this stuff in person.
Yeah,
the nonverbal communication. I know. I'm like, if I want to be in person all the time, can we just be in person? So that's. Thank you, Curt, so much.
Thank you, Curt. We really
I would love part 2 and 5 and 9 and 25. But in the meantime, I continue to listen to your podcast, and I would encourage everyone to listen to the Being Known podcast. And so thank you so much, Curt.
Very kind.
Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And I'd love to come back and hang out.
All right.
That'd be great.
Well, I'm going
to do this again.
I will take you on that, and I'll get back. I will.
Yeah.
Because we do have some that we have part 2, and it's just, there's so much to talk about. So thank you so much.
All right.
Great to be with you. All right, we'll see you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you again for being a faithful listener, whether you've just started listening or you've listened to all 112 episodes now. Thank you so much.
And we are so thankful for you. And hopefully we'll see some of you all in person at some of these trainings that we have coming up. Again, facetofaceministries.org/training. And there's a menu that'll be on that page. You can find out how to request us to come minister in your area and train in your area. You can find out where you can book for these events as well and get yourselves registered. So we hope to see you soon.
See you next time. Thank you for joining us today. If you're enjoying this podcast, please share it with your friends.
And please stay tuned for more great content coming your way.